Hi. So I'm Alexis Madrigal. This is my 6th or 7th year coming to the Ideas Festival and moderating sessions. And I don't think that I've ever had a panel that had quite such a big title. We are going to fix the foundations of democratic capitalism in this session. Just so you know, that's the plan. If we don't get there, that's on us. Yeah. I'm here joined, kind of going this way, by Tim Brown, the head of IDEO, which, as most of you probably know, is the world's foremost design firm and a consultancy, and just a place that has done more, probably than anybody else, to push the idea of design thinking into mainstream American culture, and a lot of that is due to Tim. Next to him is Roger Martin, who studies the future of democratic capitalism at the Martin Prosperity Institute at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. Also friends with another friend of the Atlantic, Richard Florida, and someone who's really trying to get at what's wrong with the foundation of democratic capitalism. So I think how we want to go about this is, let's talk about democratic capitalism, sort of where we are, and a lot of the thoughts, your research. And then we'll go to design thinking. So we'll kind of go problem and then possible solution or set of solutions. So let's start there.
Sure. Well, I'm looking at the future of democratic capitalism because I love democracy and capitalism, especially the intersection of the two of them. And I'm worried that we're in a bit of an unprecedented time for it in this country, which is the paragon of democratic capitalism, or has been for a long time. And if you look at the long sweep of history, for the first, I would say, 213 years of American life, 1776 to 1989, the median family in America had a reasonable prospect of advancing economically from year to year. They had a reasonable prospect of saying next year's going to be better economically than this year, and they were right almost all the years. There were two bad periods, the Long Depression in the late 1800s and the Great Depression, where that wasn't the case for between kind of 10 to 15 years. But otherwise, in that 213-year period, that was the story. That changed in that the median income in 2014 was a little bit less than the median income of 1989. So that's a quarter of a century of stagnation of a sort that's never been experienced by the median family in America in its history. And the thing that makes it a little bit more problematic for democratic capitalism is in the last great period where there was that downdraft, the Great Depression, actually the top 1% and the top 10% both did worse than the median. So there's a great actually compression in inequality in that period. In this period, the top 1% has done better than it's done ever in the history of the country. So the median family now has to think about a quarter century long with no obvious prospects for getting better, of complete stagnation, while another tiny segment of American economic life does really well. And I just don't think that's stable for democratic capitalism. It's okay for capitalism, right? If you don't care about democracy, it's fine, right? You can be China and say, we care about capitalism, but not democracy. But I kind of care about the democratic part of it. And if the 51st percentile family, which is the swing voter, starts to say, this is not working, it hasn't worked for a long time, it shows no prospects for working, I think we've got a problem on our hands.
So how do you see the sort of infrastructural foundations of democratic capitalism? Like, do you have, what's going wrong sort of a level below the sort of numbers that you've described?
Well, the thing that I'm looking at in the big research project that we're doing and Tim's helping us on is looking at what lies beneath this big machine we call democratic capitalism. There's a bunch of physical infrastructure that enables it. There's a bunch of transactional infrastructure, capital markets rules, regulations that allow people to transact business, and then a knowledge infrastructure. And what I'm trying to understand is are those infrastructures getting ever less fit for purpose? Did they propel us forward to make America the richest country of any consequential size in the world by far? And that infrastructure was good for that period of development and has changed. And I'm worried that that's the case. I'm worried that our knowledge infrastructure has gotten ever more siloized when the problems of the world are more complex. I worry that our transactional infrastructure has tilted itself to support people who trade value rather than people who actually create value. And of course, our physical infrastructure, to a great extent, is not being invested in. And so I don't have answers yet to the which is the problem, but that's what we're looking at, to say there has to be an infrastructure that makes this wonderful thing called democratic capitalism work. And since it's not working, what can we say about the infrastructure?
So there you go. There's your problem. Big problems. Tim, why don't you take us through, just give us limb the history of kind of design thinking. How many people here have actually heard that phrase? How many people have heard it not at Aspen? just making sure. Just saying, okay. All right.
So Aspen is not the font of all knowledge, just most knowledge?
We do get out of that a little.
But let's go through it anyway, just so we're all on the same page. How we went from design being about the shape of chairs into design being about democratic capitalism.
Well, yeah, it's a bit of a leap, isn't it? It's a bit of a leap. But it turns out design was always about the latter rather than the former. At its essence, design is about how we're intentional about the world we create as a species, right? I mean, the world either is, the natural world occurs on its own. Everything else we create. And we can either be intentional about it or we can not be intentional about it. We just let it happen. When we're intentional about it, we're designing. So, whether we're called designers when we do it, when we think of ourselves as designers, that's sort of irrelevant. But design is at the very heart of how we shape the world around us. And so when the freeway system got built in the 50s, that was a design program, right? That was an intentional piece of design to connect cities across America with a piece of infrastructure. Just as when, the team at Apple designs the latest product that they launch, like this thing, they're intentional about how it's going to perform, how it's going to be, how you're going to experience it. And that's design. So design operates across this huge spectrum. Now, design got siloed in the latter part of the Industrial Revolution, the latter part of the 20th century, because it was so effective at helping product manufacturers launch successful things out into the world. Started off with the car industry, but then spread right through almost all of manufacturing industry to be an inherent part of what made manufacturers successful was good design. And America took a little longer to catch up on that idea than Europe did, or even Japan, but we all got there in the end. And so we came to assume that design was about this very narrow thing, the development of products that were going to be successful in the marketplace. But it's really always been a much broader thing than that. And design has always played its role in communications, for instance, in your world, in media. It's been a very powerful force in media for helping you communicate more successfully, whether that's through graphic design or film or whatever it might be. With the digitization of everything, it's seeped out into more and more of our sort of daily experiences, because technology is seeped out into more and more of our daily experiences. And so we think of, there's really hardly an experience we have that isn't facilitated through design. We've seen a big shift in Silicon Valley over the last 10 years from a focus purely on technology to one that is about the kind of graceful intersection of design and technology, something that Steve Jobs used to talk about when he was alive. And so now we have design experiences many times a day in almost every part of our life. But fundamentally, it comes back to how do you shape those experiences to be as beneficial, as delightful, as desirable, as effective as they can be. And that's the process of design.
So what are the conceptual tools that designers work with? Rapid prototyping, for example, or things along those lines.
So there's really three big buckets of conceptual tools. I think there's how we understand the world, how we shape our ideas, and then what we do with those ideas once we've had them. So the how we understand the world, where those ideas come from, largely comes from understanding how we as human beings behave and interact. It could be at the individual level if one's trying to design how something like this might be better. Or it could be at the societal level if we're talking about things like infrastructure. And so designers any designers, professional or otherwise, spends all their time being curious about the world and being out in the world and studying it and using whatever tools might be available, whether they're the tools of social science, anthropology, ethnography, those sorts of things, or they're simply the tools of the curious mind. Because it's through the curious mind that the questions emerge that lead to the interesting creative breakthroughs, the questions that reframe the problem, the questions that challenge assumptions, for instance. So there's a whole set of tools in that bucket. There's then a set of tools about how we make ideas. And obviously, a lot of them are not linguistic tools. Design often is a process of visualizing the future. Again, that might be through film, it might be through drawing, it might be through making things.
Notes.
It might be
That's
through
what I
post-it notes.
associate with,
Yes, there's a very close connection between the growth of design thinking and the success of 3M and their post-it notes. And they're delightfully generous with them. And yes, one day we'll figure out how to make reusable post-it notes. That'll probably be good. Probably the most important idea, though, within that, within this sort of bucket of how we make ideas, is this notion of very rapid iterative learning. The reason you express an idea is to judge it, is to explore it, to understand how good it is. Now, really, expert designers can often do that with like Frank Gehry, for instance. He can do that with a little sketch on a napkin or on a note paper that expresses his idea. We may not be able to judge it, but he can, right? Because he understands exactly what he means through this delightful little sketch. Mostly, we're trying to judge ideas at the level of how other people might perceive them, so we have to go a little bit further than that. And that's where things like rapid prototyping are so important. How can we launch our idea out into the world very quickly in such a way that we can learn from it, so that we can do it again better and do it again better until we get to something that's remotely fit for purpose. And when we're talking about complex ideas, like things like infrastructure, for instance, you just have to do a lot more of it. You often have to break the big idea up into little pieces and experiment and explore and prototype those, and then put them back together again. So for instance, when a car manufacturer is designing and developing a new car, they don't wait until they've got the whole thing together before they have their first prototype. They'll be prototyping, often digitally these days, but they'll be prototyping each piece of it, each little piece of it, and then they'll put those pieces together as they learn about them, and eventually they'll have the complete thing. And so this idea of rapid learning and rapid prototyping is really important. And then what we do with those ideas once we've got them is where design, I think, starts to sort of cross over into other worlds. The world of storytelling, for instance. Great design thinking is as much about how you bring people along with the idea as it is about getting to the idea itself. So there's a kind of the persuasive piece of design. So great storytelling is really important. And then all of the knowledge it takes to take an idea that's nascent and have it operate out in the world. If that's a product, that might be how you manufacture it, how you engineer it, how you market it, what business model might be associated with it. If it's a service, it might be to do with what kinds of people you need to find to kind of actually operate that service, how you train them. So there are a whole series of kind of supplementary design decisions that come on the basis of the idea that you have, depending on the kind of medium that it's operating in.
Can I just add in just one thing on why design thinking versus design? Like design's been around for a long time. That's sort of the concept of design thinking, which is sort of now gaining sort of popularity. What's different? The way I think about it is going back to Tim's sort of siloization, is that design grew up within media. Right? It was design of products, design of logos, design of graphical user interfaces, design of buildings, or our architecture, and I think what's happened, and certainly Tim and I have been working on this, is abstracting back from that to say what is the consistent pattern of thinking that goes across all of those design endeavors, because the field as a whole wasn't very good at saying that. It was very good at practicing. So you go to design school and practice on graphic design, and you become a graphic designer. But stepping back and saying, is there a standard set of thinking procedures and tools that inform all of design? I think that's where, to me, the most interesting things are now, because if you can extract that set of tools, you can then say, what more complicated things that we've not designed before in this sort of thoughtful way could you apply that set of tools to? And I think that's what Tim and I think are most interested in doing, is abstract that set of tools and then say, what can you do? Right. Can you actually apply that to repairing fixing, making democratic capitalism work better.
And having those heuristics really is what allowed us to go on the journey that we've gone, in my organization, from designing things like the first mouse and the first laptop to designing new school systems or the way pieces of government work and things, the sort of opportunities we get to work on today. It wasn't that we, back then, were thinking one day we'd like to work on that stuff. It's been a journey of discovery and realizing that these ideas, these methodologies apply as long as you can figure out how to go to each subsequent level of complexity. And it gets harder every time you go up to a level of complexity because you need more expertise, you need more collaboration, you need to deal with systemic relationships that are harder to understand. And so it's not that it's an easy translation, but so far we've managed to make each step and find something interesting to do.
And it started in August of 2003.
Okay.
Where we spent a day together talking about this very thing. So it's been sort of a fun, I guess now, 12-year journey.
Cool. I've often thought that it was the extension of the kind of user interface. Like the user interface kind of jumped out of our computers and jumped out of our phones out into the world. And now you can think of yourself as a user of all these services that are not actually digital or don't actually require a web browser, apps, or anything. I think that has just helped people conceptualize, like, oh, this is a designed experience as you go through Whole Foods in the same way that a designed experience that you navigate, Uber
Yeah, it was. When we first started working on software back in the mid-'80s, it was that realization. It was that realization that design, at least in my world, because I trained as an industrial designer, where I was essentially trained to design static objects. This is not true for some other design fields, but in my field, it was the realization that design went from a static thing to a narrative thing, and that therefore one was designing an experience when we were designing graphical user interfaces as we were back then, and that it was assembling the skills to do that. And when we first started doing graphical user interface design, for instance, the only way we had to simulate one of those interfaces was with what was called then a Quantel paint box, which was a piece of technology, a Quantel paint box, which was a piece of technology that only the biggest TV studios had. It cost about $10,000 a day to use these things. And that was the only way you could graphically simulate a moving image, right? So when we wanted to show what a window did when you clicked on it, the only way we could do that then was to use a piece of technology that the TV guys used that was extremely expensive. And then this little company called Macromind came along and invented a piece of software called Director that allowed us to do it on our Macs. But it's so often the case, the development of the methodologies goes along with the development of the tools.
Yeah. So we've now kind of set up. We've got design thinking. We've got democratic capitalism. How did you two decide to sort of smash these two things together, or figure out, like, where did you gain purchase on the idea here of applying design thinking to democratic capitalism?
Well, I guess because Tim and I had been working for like about a decade on things in design, and I was sort of embarking on this question of democratic capitalism, it appeared to me, rather than sort of a classical analytical challenge as economists would take on, it was more of a design challenge. So one of the first things I started off that is to phone up Tim and say, can we play together on this? Can we view this as a challenge in redesign? And Tim, because he always wants to play, said that sounds like fun.
And I also think when we reflected on the work that we've been doing ever more of over the last few years, so many of the challenges that are getting brought to us today are essentially infrastructural challenges, whether it be around education or healthcare, or other government services, or mobility and transportation, for instance. I mean, we have found ourselves working on these things for a while now, and I was interested in as I always am, is I find as a creative person, it's extremely helpful for whatever you think you're working on at the time, is to see if you can't take one step back and look at it with a sort of another order of magnitude to sort of get some context, understand what you're doing. So we've been working on school systems. We've been working on sort of the future of how healthcare might work as it gets disaggregated from hospitals as it is today, and we've been thinking about how digital services in government might work better. But taking this other step back and saying, well, actually, this all adds up to one big system, and that these are all pieces of infrastructure that support the way we think we want to run our society. It's really helpful because it gives you a sense of why you're doing this stuff. And it also gives you something then to evaluate the success, your success on. It's not so much, did we launch this new school, but is this new school creating kids who are going to be able to participate in this future that we want to have? So that's one of many reasons why I was enthusiastic about this.
Well, and let's try and make it slightly more concrete. Like something like the rollout of healthcare.gov, which didn't go very well, as many of you remember. The site had all kinds of problems. The president had to sort of fly out a bunch of advisors from Silicon Valley to try and fix it all. It was a mess. It's kind of fallen out of the news, but it was a big deal at the time. How would you have done that rollout differently, or how would you have advised people to try and do something like that differently if you'd been in the beginning of the healthcare legislation?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things I would have said that's just too hard. Right? The notion of saying on a given day we're going to try and launch this relatively entirely new thing that's going to fundamentally change the way Americans interact with the healthcare system. I mean, just think about it. Like, good luck. Good luck. Good luck. You can't get from here to there. If instead the designers of the system, or the architects, let's say of the system, would have said, you know what, we're going to have to experiment a lot here and get to a point where we've got these exchanges working well. So what we have to do is launch a prototype. We'll tell people it's a prototype. We'll say, please, if you're adventurous, try this up front, just like you're a beta customer for software. The software industry is so clever, right? They ship not very good stuff out to wild-eyed enthusiasts who spend all their waking moments finding bugs and being excited about finding bugs and be able to report that. Like, it's awesome. Mm-hmm. All the work they get to do. If instead they would have said that instead, it wouldn't have been perceived as a gigantic, enormous failure. So you would have just said, this is a prototype, give us your feedback, and we'll make it better, and we'll make it better, and in due course, it'll be awesome. So that's one thing I would have done.
Well, it's a great illustration of what happens in this tension between policymaking and design. That the desire of policymakers is to imagine the future and then just have it happen as fast as it can, right? So, and that was the process that the government went through, and it was done with the best of intention, right? And they were attempting to create a policy that would be good for millions of Americans. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that what was wrong was the assumption that you could leap from that to a reality that would perfectly reflect the desires of policy. And the more complex something is, the less likely that is to happen. And so somehow, and I'm not entirely sure how this needs to work, but somehow we need to change the order. So maybe the design needs to happen first and then the policy making. So that you experiment, figure out where things might go wrong and where they might work, and then you go build your policy based on what you've learned. And then by then you're ready to go kind of launch the right thing. I honestly don't know, but it was clear that the design could not keep up with the policy making, and it also, of course, as inevitably happens, was crunched into a very short period of time. So there was no chance to have any of this iterative learning that you might have. I mean, as I think got reported in the media. I mean, there were plenty of those experts that got flown in who were saying we would never have built a piece of software like this. It wasn't that they wouldn't have built a piece of software to do that. It's just that they wouldn't have not given them themselves the chance to figure out whether it was working or not before they launched it to 50 million people or 25 million people.
Yeah. And it's the second time, right? Hillary Clinton did that under the first Clinton presidency.
She never got as far as a policy, though.
Right. Well, yeah, but she did sort of the same thing. It's sort of like we'll have all the experts come together and we'll work behind closed doors to create the all singing, all dancing new healthcare system. And of course, what resulted from that?
There's an interesting counterexample, which actually now the US government's learning from and somewhat trying to replicate with the UK government. about 4 years ago, decided not to launch some big piece of new policy, but decided that it wanted to make its digital services far more effective. It believed that it was spending far too much money on developing whatever platforms there was, whether it was car licensing or the National Health Service, and it wanted to make that far more efficient. And so they put together a team that they gave complete control over in terms of new digital services for the government, and then they just let them go at it. And they launched services as they figured out what they should be. There was no grand plan about what was going to get launched when, but as they figured out how to do things, they launched them. And they took 250 websites down to one website, uk.gov, which carries out billions of transactions a year now. Everything from getting your car license renewed, to reporting that a family member has died and getting all the deaths figured out, to everything else. I mean, everything that government does. And what I think the UK government got right was to build the team and let them get on with it, and then figure out what it was going to do once. And so you walk into the team; it's about 500 strong now in London. It's like walking into Facebook. It's got the best developers in Europe working for it. It's got the best designers in Europe working for it, and they're delivering vast amounts of value for UK citizens.
It takes a lot of trust in your design and engineering team to just say, go do it, though, doesn't it? I mean, how do you actually convince people to do that?
It did take a lot of trust, but I mean, they learned as they went along, right? So I mean, my guess is, I mean, who knows? I mean, what would have happened if it had gone wrong? But if it had gone wrong, I think it would have gone wrong in such a way that we would have never known anything about it, because they would never have launched anything. And there was nothing announced beforehand. The only thing that was ever announced publicly beforehand was a report that came out of the government that said, the way you're doing it today isn't going to work, so go figure out something different. And it was just a different approach. It was a more iterative, design-based approach.
But it's also, your question is, I think, a much more general question about how, in the modern world, we think that decisions ought to get made, right? Like, we are in an era where the presumption is, in order to do something, you should have proof that it'll work first, right?
That sounds reasonable.
Yeah, it sounds reasonable, and we're very analytic. You should do the analysis. You should crunch the data. You should use big data and analytics to get to it before doing it. There's just one slight little problem, which is that no new idea in the history of the world has been proven in advance and analytically. Right? That is just a tiny. This is not my idea. This is a American pragmatist philosopher named Charles Sanders Peirce. Who sort of pointed that little problem out, and so a bunch of these things and one of the cool things about designers is designers, I think, implicitly, often not explicitly, understand that. They say any new idea is what Peirce called a logical leap of the mind. So you essentially have to imagine a path forward and then try to make it happen, right? You cannot prove anything new in advance, and if we use that as our criteria, which, by the way, most corporate R&D departments do, those same corporations complain vociferously about the lack of innovation and how their own R&D people aren't as innovative as they wish, and every time the R&D department comes forward with an idea, they say, well, we'll launch that if you can prove it. Right, and so you can't, and so they go to the bar and get drunk or something, or leave, and you don't get an innovation. So the question you pose is one I'd argue we have to think about, which is how do you actually get new things to happen in the modern world? One of the cool things about design is designers are inclined to say we have to kind of prototype, test, in order to figure out what is a good idea. Because if you think about it, all data comes from the past, right? And the problem with the future is there's no data about it yet, right? That's the bad thing about the future. The good thing about the future is in 6 months, the next 6 months is going to be in the past, right? And so you get data on it. And designers, right? So designers, I always say, why do I think Tim Brown is a successful designer? Is he figures out clever ways to turn the future into the past. Right? You use clever ways to say, let's try this little thing that is radical, but it's not going to sink us if it doesn't work instantly. We will learn. That gets data. so that we can make it better and better and better. And that is the art of design. But it's not in large organizations, large modern organizations, that is not the ethic. The ethic is you can prove things, and if you're a rigorous manager, you're a rigorous government official, you insist that things be proven before being tried.
So let's think a little bit about infrastructure and new ways of building it. I mean, do we have examples, say outside the country, that might give us some hints about ways that we can explore, rebuilding our infrastructure in this country to support democratic capitalism in a different way?
So there are examples. Somebody that Roger and I have just been writing about in an article that's coming out in HBR in a month or so is somebody based out of Peru. So this fellow's name is Carlos Rodriguez Pastor. He's probably the most successful businessman in Peru today. Grew up in the Bay Area in California, actually, and went back in the mid-90s and bought a small bank, and now has a multi-billion-dollar company serving the middle class across banks and supermarkets and shopping malls and cinemas and a whole bunch of other things. He has about 20-something companies.
So far, this seems like a conventional success
Right,
story.
exactly. Yeah. So his stated purpose is to grow the size of the middle class in Peru, because they're going to be his customers, right? And he's building businesses that serve the middle class in Peru. He realized a couple of things. Firstly, that there's nothing the middle class care more about than the education of their children. And he needs many, many more educated folks coming into the workforce to become part of his companies. So he bought a fledgling little private school company. I think it had one or two schools at the time, and then came to see us and asked if we could help him retool that school system and massively scale it to think differently about how we educate Peruvian kids. And so 3 years later, we have 29 schools. We're on the way to many, many more schools. We have this one, there's two lessons here about one, he had vision about, I think I need to affect the school system in order to build the sort of future I want for Peru. But then he came to us with the freedom to look at every piece and part of that system. We weren't asked just can we design new school campuses that are better than the ones we have today. It was, we want to design the physical infrastructure of the school, we want to redesign the curriculum, we want to redesign the fundamental learning philosophy we have, we want to redesign or design all of the technology tools that we use to support it, we want to design a new business model, we want to redesign how teachers get trained. Every aspect of the system was up for grabs. And we took the best of what we could find in various places. We took Saul Khan from the Khan Academy, who's been here, I know, before, down to Peru to provide the kind of blended learning model that we used. Designed these beautiful schools that are popping up now all over the country, and ended up with something we think is going to be scalable. I mean, it's a middle-class private school system, about $100 a month. Each new school is subscribed to before it gets built. So no marketing necessary. And with the initial schools that we have, doubling the attainment scores in math and English for the students that are attending them. So good news, so far good news. But it's that ability to look at every piece of the system, I think, that was a hugely important part of being able to make this successful, along with Carlos's sort of vision to realize that education was going to be key to the future of his business, but to the future of growing the middle class in his country. And one of the sort of detailed little sort of anecdotes that I love. So he's building now the biggest shopping malls in Peru, and his anchor tenants now for those shopping malls are the schools. It's not Nordstrom or Macy's or whatever. He's realized that if he puts one of these schools next to a shopping mall, he attracts families that want to work there. He attracts families that want to come and shop there. So this idea that schools might become an integral part of our kind of retail economy is not something I've seen talked about anywhere else. So
and if I can, I like all of that, and I also supermarkets is a big part of his business. He wants supermarkets out in the hinterland, not just in Lima. Recognize that what the supermarkets might do is actually damage the fates of local producers if he sources them all from the big, large producers and then ships the product out there. So they created a program. As they expanded out, they created a program program for supporting and helping regional farmers upgrade their capabilities and then supply back into the stores in Lima and the other big cities. So there's these thousands now of producers who, rather than seeing a supermarket come in and wreck their business, they supply that supermarket, and they supply supermarkets back in the bigger cities. So it's having that sense of how the whole system works and how you've got to make that work for everyone.
I mean, which sounds great. I mean, I think the only thing that disturbs me about it is it sort of requires us to rely on sort of benevolent billionaires to do like anything interesting in the world. I mean, and you see it too with the Gates Foundation. I mean, you see it all over the place that we have a system that has funneled a lot of money upwards, and then now that money is getting redistributed by these billionaires through these interesting projects. I mean, are there ways of thinking about fomenting the kind of change in design thinking that you're talking about that don't require having a billionaire decide that your cause is interesting?
Well, I'm maybe obsessing too much about this, but I think we are, in some sense, tethering lots of other organizations by essentially saying to them, you have to be able to demonstrate after the fact that you analyzed it before the fact, before you did it, right? So when you think about what we do to governments and government agencies, right? What happens if there's something that doesn't go right? We audit how they made the decision and say, you didn't have enough proof to go ahead and do that, so you were bad, right? And boards of directors are equally bad. Boards of directors of big corporations, I mean, I've served on a bunch of them. I'm never going to serve on another board again because it's
not after what you're about to say.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, after they won't ask that, but because that's what boards do, right? If things go well for the company, they say, "Good job, CEO. Good job." If things go badly, they say, "Well, you didn't tell us about this. You didn't analyze this enough. You didn't do this." So the CEOs are sort of trapped or sort of shivved. They're not trapped. Everybody's a free agent, but shivved into being kind of highly conservative and analytical. So I think the only thing about the billionaires is that they just say, I think this is a good idea. I'm on the Skoll Foundation board. Jeff Skoll, beloved Jeff Skoll, helps build eBay, and we get billions of dollars, and says, I'm going to take $1 billion of that to support social entrepreneurship. Before it was cool, it's cool now, but it wasn't then. And he just said, I'm going to do it. He didn't have proof or anything, and so I think they're unfettered from this obsession with being scientifically rigorous in a way that science was never intended to be. And so the billionaires are just freed up from that restriction. If we freed up other large establishments, government ones and corporations, from feeling the need to be scientific when they shouldn't be, I think you wouldn't have this concern, but it's only cool stories of billionaires.
I think the one other place where there's possibility is that sort of the opposite end, really, which is around things like crowdfunding. If you think about Kickstarter or Indiegogo, Kickstarter, you see creative people putting up ideas there that are imaginary, right? They've maybe built a prototype, and then thousands of people fund that idea, and in the assumption that it's going to become real and that they're going to get it. Sometimes that assumption is correct, and sometimes it's incorrect. But it's sort of evidence that if you can sort of project out into the future a little bit and make the future the present, and therefore at least allow people to assess whether they would like this thing or not, they may be willing to support it. And I think there's evidence of similar kinds of things going on in the sort of social sphere through organizations like Indiegogo, where we're seeing sort of social entrepreneurship being supported and funded by larger groups of people who see some desirability in the idea. So I think there's some grassroots possibilities through those sorts of platforms. What it would take to grow those to the scale where they could really make a difference at an infrastructure level, I have no idea whether that's even possible. But I think it's an interesting trend, and maybe we might be interesting to imagine, for instance, how the power of the billionaires and the power of the kind of crowdfunding marketplace might even come together to work on these things.
It's an interesting thought.
Do you see other signs of hope? I mean, Washington, as a policy-making apparatus, like reshaping it with design thinking seems like a tall order. Do you see it maybe lower levels of government in smaller regions, mayors, governors? Do you see some of these things starting to gain traction, some of the ideas?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think cities are a good scale for thinking about a lot of these kinds of, particularly, well, actually well, maybe not the transactional infrastructure stuff. Maybe that operates at an even greater than national scale, and that might be why it's so difficult. But I think when we're talking about knowledge infrastructure and physical infrastructure, I think cities are a good scale in which to potentially operate. And there are mayors, whether it be Boris Johnson in London or some of the Latin American mayors, who are making very bold decisions about what to do around things like transportation or housing that are going to make their cities better places to live in, are ultimately going to attract higher better qualified people, and that ultimately is going to hopefully create wealth for everybody.
Yeah, and you, well, you know, because you know my friend Richard Florida would say that he puts a lot of hope in the mayors because they've got a somewhat smaller scale, coherent thing to manage, and they can be bolder.
But also not as narrowly partisan in a lot of cases.
Yes, that's right. Although sadly, of course, one of the ones that did well was in the wrong category for you, Michael Bloomberg, who's in the billionaire category. So we.
I'm not anti-billionaire. If we're billionaires here, we should be friends. That's saying as a let's take some questions from the billionaires in the audience. We've got someone right here. You don't actually have to be a billionaire to ask a question, but this might be helpful. Do we have a mic runners? Okay, great.
Oh,
sorry, I surprised you. I'm going to go right here to the cool dress.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Alexis Diaz with G100. When I study democratic capitalism, I find that I'm increasingly focused on the cultural infrastructure that underpins a lot of this. So community building, the arts, churches, associations. There's a lot of erosion there, it seems to me, and the user experience is definitely affected by that. And I'm just curious about your work in those areas.
Well, on that front, the MPI, one of our fantastic super smart fellows is Jonathan Haidt, the Stern scholar who is actually doing a big project for our work on the moral infrastructure underpinning business, because I think that moral, ethical, infrastructural elements shape a lot of action. So I think that's an important area in culture in general. Adam Grant's also doing a piece of work on us about how did we get to a sort of a take economy versus a give economy. So I think you're pointing to very important areas, and we're doing some I think really cool stuff with cool people on that.
A couple of extra things I would add is, firstly, we somehow have to reintegrate kind of culture and business. Somehow we see business about wealth generation and culture being what we do on the side after we've done all that other stuff, and that seems entirely inappropriate to me. And then the other thing we have to revisit is how we think about the individual versus the community, and how we think about generations, I think, within communities too. So many of the what appear to be potentially intractable problems around, for instance, how we deal with aging and aging care, are not going to be solved unless we figure out how to bring generations back together again. Financial services, which we focus so much on the individual, yet when we go to Asia or you go to the Middle East, where financial services are family-oriented or extended family-oriented and are about looking after a community, it seems that we need to introduce much more of that kind of thinking into the way we think about financial services here in America, in order to support things like education much later in life, so that we can reinvent our careers, or in order to support a much longer lifespan that we have.
Historical footnote too, Aspen original purpose, basically, the beginning of these festivals back in the middle of the 20th century was about bringing culture and business together, trying to sort of civilize the American business person.
Yep.
Let's,
Mortimer Adler.
How about right there, right next to you, that's easy.
Thanks. It's a little off topic. This is for Tim. I understand that IDEO is working to redesign Judaism. I want to know how that works.
You actually filmed me, by the way, for this because my wife is Jewish and I'm
Okay.
not. Yeah.
I'm not personally working on it, so I can't give you a whole lot of detail. I think Judaism is a great example of a culture that's deep and meaningful to obviously a lot of people, and some concern amongst some of those who participate in that religion that it's not as identifiable or as meaningful to younger generations as it once was, and are there ways that from what very little I know about Judaism, it's actually a religion that's done quite a bit of reinvention over its history, and so there's an interest in is there other opportunities for reinvention that might engage kind of younger potential members. So that's really where the focus is. We're working a little bit with Steven Spielberg and his foundation on that, and we're excited by it. And I know that some of the designers are working on it are very excited about it because the kind of iconography and visual language of Judaism is extremely powerful, and one that I know that creatively is quite inspirational. But can't say a whole lot more about it because I actually I'm not working on it.
As a research subject in this study, actually,
yeah,
for real,
you probably know more about
that. Most of it was probing and deep questions about my wife's relationship to Judaism, my relationship to Judaism, our son's relationship to Judaism, and how we want that to work. What is it we found useful about synagogues? What it is that we found useful about the rituals of, say, Passover? It's actually an incredible. Your people did a very good job. They were really, really
I'm
good.
so glad to hear that.
We were like, they came into our house and you're sort of like, wait, you want to talk to us about redesigning Judaism? But then by the end of it, it was, we're practically in tears. It's great. Let's go right here. We have a black T-shirt with color squares on it. I love that.
Pantone tags by the look of it.
Yeah, kind of design-oriented T-shirt, huh?
It is.
Let's go to your title about why democratic capitalism needs design thinking. So that implies resource and funds, and I'm interested in the intersection of potentially finite pools of funds, especially in governmental entities working across private sector to create new infrastructure that can support, in America specifically, competitiveness, because we're falling behind in so many areas around infrastructure. What's your thinking regarding the ability, as the president has done recently, bringing in outside people like a new CTO for the federal government coming from the private sector, and then resourcing from the private sector to achieve, to your point, rapid prototyping and other things that the government, other than maybe ARPANET and the internet, weren't so good at in recent times?
Yeah, I think it's great that those connections are being made. I'm not entirely sure that the only or best solution is to bring business into government. I think it might be to let business do some things that then government. I would argue that government could take some of the same strategic approaches that business takes, which is let the innovation happen and then acquire it, rather than necessarily have to do it all itself. And so I'd like to see a little bit more interest, and I think we are seeing some of this in education, where we're seeing, there's a certain amount of seed funding that's coming from government, but also from a lot of other places that's allowing a lot of interesting, some of the blended learning stuff or other ed tech things that are happening that then have the opportunity to be reincorporated into public education systems, for instance. So I think there's some evidence that that's working might work in the education space. There are many other areas of infrastructure where some of those same things could potentially happen. But I think I would see the role of government might be more to promote and where possible catalyze innovation that might be appropriate for infrastructure, rather than trying to build great big innovation organizations within government to do it all itself. Some of that might be fine, but I wouldn't necessarily argue that would be the best and only place to do it.
Let's go right there.
Hi, hello. My name is Maria Martinez. I'm with the Brookings Institution. And I wanted to ask you both about special and entrenched interests when it comes to redesigning capitalism, democratic capitalism. I love the example that you give about Peru, and I would love to see something similar happen in the US. But I can imagine imagine already somebody having some sort of complaint about it in the sense that it disrupts an existing system where they're already benefiting, especially in the educational system. So I would like to hear about, when you're thinking about redesigning democratic capitalism, how do you think about existing interests that you have to design around?
And I think, just to, because I wanted to ask you this question too, it's like, why is design thinking going to be more resistant to, the extant lobbying forces that exist of all kinds than traditional forms of policymaking?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in some sense it's just a feature of the landscape, and I'm interested in the term of art too, which is special interest, right? Everybody's got interests, and generally the ex post definition of a special interest is one you don't like. So it then becomes labeled special, which in this case special is bad. But so the way I think about it is that if you want to work on and study democratic capitalism, you have to actually accept the premises of democracy, which is that there will be all sorts of different interests, and that creates a very tricky design challenge, especially if you have this rule which says somehow 51% have to be in enough agreement to go forward. It's harder than it is. 51% of people didn't say I want a Mac when it was launched. You can sort of build into something. In this case, the wheels of government require you to put together something that appeals to 51%. So I think rather than think of it as a problem, I just think about it as kind of the way it is. It's the context that you're designing for. Then the question is, can you design a process of intervention? So your intervention design, can you design a process that makes it harder for the people who seem least democratic, right? And easier for the people who seem most democratic. And if the people who seem most democratic want something that benefits a greater percentage of people, the people who are least democratic want something that benefits the least number of people, right? How can design improve that? In my view, in some sense, making legislation, putting one sunsets on it, and prototyping it, and not trying to make it perfect before you launch, makes it harder for the people who have a narrow interest to have their interest prevail. So they may have their interest prevail in the first iteration, but when the first iteration doesn't work well for that democratic context, then it gets changed. In the current environment, where you're a bank and you've got one shot on Dodd-Frank to emasculate Dodd-Frank as much as you possibly can, so it doesn't do anything, right? That's your interest if you're a bank, pretty much.
Special interest. That's your special interest.
Yeah, and so if there's one shot, you spend everything that you need to spend now, all political capital, all actual capital to get that. If instead it's, even if you do that a year later, when it turns out that ain't working, it isn't producing what we want, it just gets reversed. One, it'll discourage you from investing so heavily in it, and allow the other interests to have their voice heard, because something has to work well for a broad number of people to say, I think that worked well and doesn't need redesign. So I think it can improve the balance of legislation being, or regulation rules, whatever, working better for more people if we took this iterative approach.
Yeah. Let's go way in the back right there.
Thank you. I'm Michael Conniff. I'm at the Isaacson School for New Media. I've spent a lot of my career trying to figure out the future. And this idea of clever ways to turn the future into the past, I wonder if you'd comment on seeing the future in the present, because I've always believed that the future almost always exists in the present if you can just find it or see it.
Right. It's just not evenly distributed, as Gibson said.
Not evenly distributed. One example of this was the idea that was known as closed user groups in 1980. This idea that you would have a closed network that everyone agreed to belong to. Well, that 30 years later was Facebook. And at the time, it seemed like a terrible idea. Nobody could see any application for it. So I wonder if you, how do you look at the present to determine the future? Or do you?
Well, I'll answer the more kind of conceptual side of that, which is if you go to Peirce and say how did all new ideas come about, he would say it's making an inference to the best explanation. So he said what you do to create the future is you observe things. He was a pragmatist. You observe things where you don't yet have enough data, so everything isn't that way, but you see a data point here, a data point there, and you say, how can I best explain that? And then you try something on the basis of your answer to that question. And so if you believe in Gibson and say the future, it's already here, it's just not evenly distributed, even distribution of the future means you've got data, analyzable data. Little snippets means that you have to make that logical leap of the mind, an inference to the best explanation of what's going on. And the people who are best at creating the future, I think, both have an ability to do that, to look at a data point from here, data point from here, put it together. Also have the intestinal fortitude to do it, to say, I believe enough to try it, and then have enough stick-to-itiveness to make it happen. So I think that's how you can use the present, and I think you have to use the present to the best of your ability to create those inferences.
Yeah, I mean that same idea in the way that shows up in terms of what we do is we're always looking for extremes. We're always searching for the edges of behaviors, for instance. I mean, what you described with the closed user group is a behavior that existed 30 years ago. Nobody was quite clear about what that behavior meant, but it existed, and you could imagine, you could potentially imagine where that could go. So we spend a lot of our time going out to the edges of things instead of analyzing the center of things, which is another difference between, I think, a sort of a creative design thinking approach versus an analytical approach, where you tend to look
Yours
at
is statistically not rigorous.
Absolutely. Statistically nothing at all. One of the things I'm very proud, I don't understand statistics, it's probably a good job. But we go to the edges, and sometimes that means the sort of the edges of a market. More often it's the edges of places. We go to other parts of the world or other communities that might be displaying different behaviors today that might be relevant to the future, and mostly they're inspiration for us. They're not, and there's some evidence, but there's mostly inspiration. So it allows us to think differently and frame differently, and then when we've got that, we can build some prototypes and try and get some evidence. You're absolutely right. Those sorts of extremes are very important.
I like that as a close to our session. We're going to go to the edges. That's what you can take with you through Aspen. We are out of time. Join me in thanking the two of them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.